Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd like to begin by thanking the victims of violence who have come here and the members of law enforcement. I'd like to thank the members of law enforcement for your service on the front lines, and to the victims of violence, I express the deepest sympathies that law enforcement was not able to prevent the horrific crimes you suffered. Mr. Heslin, I have two little girls. I cannot imagine the suffering you're experiencing now. I've spent much of my adult life in law enforcement working to deter violent criminals and to ensure that those who commit horrific crimes of violence face the very strictest of punishments. And I'm sorry for each of the victims here today who lost loved ones, that the system did not work to protect your loved ones and prevent the loss of life. This is an issue that touches on a lot of emotions, and I would suggest an approach that, in my view, should guide the Senate's treatment of it, which is an approach that we should target our efforts to violent criminals, to those who commit horrific crimes of violence, and we should not target our efforts to needlessly restricting the constitutional liberties of law-abiding citizens. In the area of gun control, I think there are a variety of proposals that are discussed. Some, in my judgment, the evidence demonstrates are cosmetic, and they allow politicians to say we are acting, but the evidence doesn't support that they have any efficacy. Others, I think, present a real threat of intruding on the liberties of law-abiding citizens. I want to start, Mr. Walsh, with respect to the assault weapons ban.
Yes.
And in earlier questioning, you said that there had not been enough study on the assault weapons ban. Of course, a very similar law was in effect for roughly a decade. And the Department of Justice has funded at least 3 studies of whether that bill had any positive effect. In 1999, the DOJ study concluded that the assault weapons ban, quote, failed to reduce the average number of victims per gun murder incident or multiple gunshot wound victims. In 2004, the National Institute for Justice concluded that the assault weapons ban produced, quote, no discernible reduction in the lethality and injuriousness of gun violence. And then in 1997, the study that was already discussed likewise concluded that there was no evidence to say any meaningful effect different from zero. Are you aware of any compelling empirical data to the contrary? We've got 3 studies funded by the Department of Justice that concluded the prior ban had no effect. Are you aware of empirical data to the contrary?
Senator, let me say 2 things in response, and I think it's an important question to ask. First of all, my understanding of what those studies said is that the statistical analysis was inadequate to establish an effect, not that it had statistically established no effect. It's a fine point, but it's an important one, because Dr. Copper, who led the studies in each of those instances, most recently came out with a January 2013 sort of update description of his studies and thoughts for the future, and in that indicated that he thought that an argument could be made that over time, if the assault weapon ban had continued past 10 years and had been continued to be coupled with a high-capacity magazine ban, that the combination of those 2 things might have had as much as a 5% effect.
But if I understand your answer correct, you did not point to any empirical data that demonstrate that it had any effect whatsoever on violent crime. Is that correct?
Not conclusive evidence that it had an effect on a overall.
Inconclusive. I mean, any empirical data.
Well, I think that the empirical data that Dr. Copper is referred to, you could say he said he believed that there was certainly a suggestion that on the margin there was an impact, but it wasn't necessarily statistically significant that he could tell from his work. Now, having said that, there are two areas that I think are important to keep in mind statistically, if I can risk that. One is that there's certainly good evidence that assault weapons are used disproportionately in attacks with multiple victims and victims with multiple wounds. And then secondly, there is also good evidence to suggest that assault weapons are used disproportionately on attacks on law enforcement officers. And I think those 2 points, perhaps even standing alone, would justify that we proceed with the assault weapons, an assault weapons ban.
Mr. Walsh, there was earlier discussion about causation and correlation.
That's correct.
According to the BJS, from 1993 to 2001, which roughly corresponds with the assault weapons ban, not perfectly, but roughly, there were an average of 611 homicides per year with rifles, while the assault weapons ban was in effect. In 2010, the number of homicides with rifles was 358, a little more than half as much. In 2011, it was 323. That's without the assault weapons ban in place. Would you agree that that data does not suggest that the assault weapons ban had any significant efficacy in reducing violent crime?
Well, I think that if we go back and look at the studies, that the conclusion of Dr. Copper and his colleagues was that there were multiple factors playing into that. Fortunately, over that same period of time, we were seeing overall a reduction in violent crime in the United States, which also impacted it. So the simple answer is I don't have a statistical response for you. I'm not an expert in that area. I think it's fair to say that the evidence of the effectiveness of the original assault weapon ban was mixed, but there were some areas in that, as I've already mentioned, where the Department of Justice believes there was a positive effect in reducing the total number of victims. And if the ban were extended and not made to sunset after 10 years, that over time we could see an improvement in public safety.
My time has expired, but I hope as the hearing proceeds, we can discuss how the Department of Justice and law enforcement can target violent criminals directly rather than either legislation that the data could suggest would have no material effect or legislation that would strip law-abiding citizens. Instead, I would suggest we should be targeting violent criminals because that's how we actually will protect people's lives, which is everyone's objective here.